Dante between philology and philosophy. And we bring quite varied backgrounds to this study, which I think is very appropriate for the approach to method that I want to be presenting, which is really very open to the unlikely kinds of combinations, contextualizations. This has been, I think, very much the ethos of theory. This theory movement now, for several decades in our departments of language, literature, comparative literature, we've been inundated with theoretical approaches. There's been a lot of resistance to it as well, but this is one of the horizons for method that we want to be reflecting on, I think, in a workshop like this. There's then, the resistance could be figured as coming from the camp of philology, where you have a defined object, at least as it's traditionally conceived. I want to be moving in the direction of a speculative philology, a speculative kind of criticism that takes philology very seriously and reintegrates it as a kind of foundation, just to suggest the kind of approach to this topic of philology and philosophy that I myself want to be propounding, outlining for you in some ways. Now, Dante is, of course, a focus, right in the title of our seminar. Dante has been very much a focus for a lot of work of mine, but a focus for reaching out almost as far as one can, even to Scandinavian literature, to focus some of the essential concerns of all of the fields of the humanities. And I think this is one of the virtues of theory, to help open up our discourse on a traditional field like Dante to its unlimited connections with all sorts of other fields. And this is the way I really understand theology to work as well. And I've already indicated that there's this horizon of theory, that is, Dante studies after the theoretical turn was really one of the subtitles for this workshop that I suggested. Another would be Dante studies after the theological turn. And I see these two as very closely connected, or at least as kindred. There's been a movement coming even from Notre Dame, notably, one of the universities represented here, to reread Dante very much as a theologian. Dantean theology has become a topic. This has been on my agenda from the very beginning of my work, and it's really been fused, integrated with the theoretical approaches to criticism that I've been advocating. Let me then just refer to the first book that I published here on Dante, Dante's Interpretive Journey. This is 1996. Where is it? Can we go past it? Okay, there it is. Dante's Interpretive, 1996. And this is what, coming out of my dissertation work. It was a reading of the Divine Comedy, but also a theory of interpretation. That is, taking Heidegger, Gadamer, hermeneutic theory and using them to read the Divine Comedy as an event, really, of theological revelation, a hermeneutic event. The first chapter of this book is Dante's address to the reader. And there are those famous addresses to the reader that Auerbach wrote about, and gave a certain kind of centrality to within the Commedia. And then, I really turned this into the frame for the whole poem as an event of divinity, of theological truth. It all happens in the address to the reader, in the reader's encounter with the text. That becomes really a hermeneutic event of revelation. And then I'm trying to work out the theological existential hermeneutic that is implied within the Divine Comedy, and using that then to critique some of the limitations, the closure of our modern hermeneutic theory to theological revelation, which has become unintelligible to us in so many ways, and yet shouldn't. It can come back. We ought to be able to really understand what is at stake in theological revelation, rather than having to dismiss it as a supernatural belief that belongs to another world. There's an existential reality there that we can understand and reappropriate. So this was my first attempt to read Dante from a theoretical perspective. And I jump forward, actually jumping over many other sorts of projects, to 2013, which is really the other monograph that I devoted to Dante exclusively. Where is it? Here we go. Dante in the sense of transgression. This takes not German hermeneutic theory, but rather French thinking of difference, deconstruction. This is Bataille, Blanchot, Derrida, Lévinas, some Roland Barthes, and their style of theory as being crucial to another aspect of theological revelation in the Divine Comedy, which comes out especially in the Paradiso, where Dante encounters the limits of interpretation and of language. The ineffability topos frames that portion of the poem. That is the whole of the Paradiso from beginning to end. The hermeneutic paradigm interpretation works less well in the Paradiso. And in fact, there's much less about Paradiso in Dante's interpretive journey, not by design, but I realized later that I needed another theoretical paradigm in order really to do justice to the Paradiso. And I found its contemporary equivalents in the thinking of difference, its focus on alterity, the absolute ineffability of the divine. So that I take as being the other major model of theory. We've got hermeneutics, deconstruction, and then we've got all sorts of other styles and movements of theory. They flow from in various ways. I think these two major paradigms. We've got reader reception and new historicism and post-colonial and feminism and queer theory and all sorts of theory which draw on these poles and take them to some very interesting
you mean
new
the German
places.
and the French pole? Is that what you mean?
Exactly. Yes. Those two poles: the German hermeneutics, French deconstruction, and a lot of my work then has gone between those poles. But I want now to take the occasion to reflect on the role of theory broadly, and even moving away from or beyond those specific paradigms, opening it to many other kinds of theory, but also conjugating that horizon with the theological. And I should say that the theological for me is primarily negative theology, which is a kind of critique, really. It's the fact that whatever we say about God is inadequate. It's, in fact, idolatrous. When we take theology in the sense of negative theology, and therefore as infinite critique, that is, any concept whatsoever of the divine needs to be subjected to critique and dealt with in terms of its inadequacy in order to open up an infinite space of the inconceivable. And that's all that can really direct the mind and the whole existence of a human being towards God. This idea of infinite critique, I would suggest, actually brings theology very much into line with the kind of radical theory that I would like to advocate, or at least to excavate. That is, theory a priori can be opposed to theology in so many ways, and this has often been the ethos of theory in the university. To de-theologizing Dante has been one of the slogans in this specific field, and de-theologizing anything has been high on the agenda of theory. But theory, I think, when it's thought through radically, just like theology thought through radically, has to become infinitely self-critical. And I would say that even a theologian like Adorno, a theorist, philosopher, but
Adorno.
Yeah, he is actually a bit of a negative theologian, together with Horkheimer as well, and difficult to make them admit that, and yet it comes out. When I think that negativa dialectic also takes the theoretical power of thinking to this extreme of infinite self-criticism, where really theory and theology coalesce and coincide. So these are really the coordinates and sort of the two horizons, which then become a single non-horizon, really, because it takes away the definition of a horizon that enables you to focus objects. It unfocuses and opens us towards the infinite. This is the gesture of theology, thought radically in its negative mode. I think it's the fundamental gesture of theory. If it really wants to think its own premises through, without limits, there are a lot of reasons for limits, of course, and we have to have limits in order to think anything, and that's a crucial part of what we're doing. But different people and different criticisms and paradigms have different limits, and in order to be able to dialogue among our different paradigms, we also have to be able to suspend our limits and then open theory to the unlimited, and there we're in this theological domain once again. Now, I want to first of all, let me fill in a little bit of background, sort of a historical genealogy of the kind of criticism here that I've just blurted out. I would take it back really to ancient times. A founding text would be Porphyry's De Antro Nympharum, the Cave of the Nymphs. In some ways, really the first work of literary criticism, one could say, that we have really intact, and very much a philosophical appropriation of this text from Homer, the passage where Odysseus is delivered to his country Ithaca by the Phaeacians and placed near the harbor Forces and by this cave, the cave of the nymphs. Porphyry is reading a very specific literary passage, but he's able to elicit from the details of Homer's description, which is only 13 lines or so, the whole Neoplatonic philosophy of metempsychosis. He sees in this cave from the south entrance, the souls enter in warmed, and then they cool down in the cave. They exit through the north when they've been combined with the bodies, right? The disembodied soul, it becomes wet and cool and then takes on body, and the stalagmites and the stalactites are the bones, and the nymphs in the cave are weaving the seaweed, and the flesh and blood of the body is formed as the souls then enter back into the body. So, the Porphyry sees in Homer, the theologian, Homer, the philosopher, the whole thrust, really, of his own Neoplatonic philosophy. So, this is an example of a theoretical, of a philosophical and theological reading of a literary text. And one can obviously say, well, this is not what Homer meant at all. And, we do definitely want to be able to try and approach the so-called original meaning of a text, even though we have to acknowledge that we always approach that with a lot of assumptions of our own, with an interpretive framework that itself has a history, and it's never simply the text on its own terms, which would sort of be the litmus test for the purely philological approach. I think it's interesting that literary criticism begins already in this philosophical mode. It's not simply a super refined and remote elaboration on a literary text that comes late in the history of criticism. Criticism starts philosophically and theologically inspired, and I think we narrow it down in order to get the more scientific, philological approach. And there's a whole history, really, to even just the Neoplatonic reading. Actually, Porphyry himself, he has this piece, the De Antro Nympharum. There's another piece by Porphyry on the Homeric question, the Questione Homericae, where the question is about the author, who was. And this is the classical question, par excellence, of philology, trying to identify the actual author. So there's already this sort of bifurcation within Porphyry. But the two live together. They even feed off of each other. And this is really what I want to be saying about philology and philosophy, the way in which they absolutely need each other. I want to work up gradually to Vico, where this becomes even programmatic. But passing through some of the other readings that we've prepared for this as well, I should just then, to complete this thought of the historical genealogy of the kind of speculative criticism or speculative philology that I'm proposing, mention where do we go from Porphyry? There's the Hellenistic readings, and Aristarchus, you would get a more philological science, but still very much in dialogue with philosophical approaches. This goes into the Latin tradition, Servius, Macrobius, Fulgentius, and then the poet of reference switches from Homer to Virgil, But they're all Neoplatonic philosophers as well. Fulgentius somewhat less so, but he's very much he's a Christian bishop, I believe. And bringing in their theories, right, their theoretical perspectives. This has been really the nature of criticism, I think, all along. We go up to Dante, sometime not too long before Dante with Bernard Silvestris, still, reading the Aeneid in a Neoplatonic vein. And I do want to even, go forward from that into the Renaissance. Giordano Bruno, with the Eroici. This is really the line that I'm drawing from. Now, of course, there's every different configuration that comes up between these disciplines in the course of this history. What I want to insist on, nevertheless, is some kind of a synergism between them all along. And I would like to suggest the way in which then philology, with its focus on the particular and the concrete, works together with the more speculative, generalizing, universal philosophical perspective by looking at, let's take our, this reading from Ginsberg, Spie, miti, emblemi. The model that he presents us, really, and with a great wealth of historical examples, which he calls he calls this model the paradigma indiziario. I think we translate that as circumstantial paradigm. These techniques, and of course it goes, divination, hunting, the seafaring, where one has to interpret signs, and one takes those concrete, specific signs, and is there some sort of a rule for interpreting them? Not really. What Ginsberg is insisting upon is the spontaneity, actually, the circumstantial paradigm. It means that the signs become illuminating in different unexpected contexts, somewhat like the sorts of theoretical readings that seem arbitrary. By what does this have to do with Marx or whatever it is? Theory is an invitation to make certain prima facie arbitrary juxtapositions to see what that reveals. This is the way in which signs have been read in all of these traditional disciplines, which are really peculiarly undisciplined. That is, they're free ways of thinking and interpreting on the basis of even serendipity. Right? It takes serendipity in order to come up with the sorts of ingenious interpretations that Ginsberg's essay is celebrating. Of course, the very word serendipity, he tells us, comes from Horace Walpole, what was it, 1753, having read really from Voltaire's Zadig, a version of this tale, the Persian tale, of the three brothers, who I guess are sons of King Serendip of Persia, who are able, the story is that there's a man who lost his camel, and these, the three brothers, then when they meet this man, he asks, have you seen my camel? And they say, well, is this a white camel, blind in one eye, carrying a wineskin, one filled with olive oil, the other filled with wine on its back? Yes, that's it. Where did you see him? No, we didn't see it. They didn't see it. And so he actually accuses them and brings them before the judge. And I think then they're able to prove how they were able to make all of these inferences, right, without having actually seen the camel. So they're acquitted. And this is then, an illustration of the kind of interpretation of signs that is really possible by such a serendipitous method. And I think another very revealing illustration of this that Ginsberg gives us is in the, he starts out with the art historian, what is this, late 19th century, Giovanni Morelli, who was able to challenge the attributions of great master paintings in some of the museums in Europe, in Berlin in particular, on the basis of a method that focused on the inessential details. Because it's really in those negligible particulars that the true signature of the artist is revealed, not in what he's famous for or she. That's what all of the imitators learn to imitate. The uplifted eyes of Perugino, or the famous smile of Leonardo. But when you look at the way in which the earlobes are reproduced, that's something that's not generally observed. It's something that is done more unconsciously. It's not where the artist is deliberately trying to, produce the work that is aimed at, but it's a routine sort of detail, the fingernails that Morelli was able to show has a certain kind of stamp. That's something that each individual does in their own way, the same way repetitively. It's a kind of fingerprint, really, of the artist. So, see, what's at stake here is the way in which the absolutely unique particular is what philology is aiming at. We have a particular text, the expression of a particular author. This is really what criticism is face to face with and is attempting to elucidate. Now, philology, as the ology part of it, becoming a science, wants to give us rules, right? And canons, methods that are formulated in order to that can be followed and applied, and that always falls short of the absolute particularity and the individuality. See, what's working here in this binomial between philology and philosophy is the tension between the particular and the universal. And really everything that's so fascinating about the nature of literary criticism and the reason that it can become really a form of revelation, and that's why I turn to theology for the models of the kind of revelation that can happen in criticism, in an interpretive engagement with a text, it can approach the absolutely individual. And in fact, there has to be that engagement with the unique individuality of the work. That can only take place from a unique, situated, contextualized standpoint of the interpreter. It's not out there in undefined space. There's a relation of the unique particular to another unique particular, and certain sparks fly, and we get this, circumstantial, indexical kind of paradigm that I think really illuminates for us what is at stake in theory, what should be at stake in theory. Theory is not just a generalizing discourse. On the contrary, it's these unexpected juxtapositions that enable a new approach to the absolute individuality of the work in question. This is why Dante says in De Vulgare Eloquentia that he has to give so many examples. He can't tell us what it is that makes the most excellent canzone in a general formula. Quam supremum vocamus, this is from Book 2, Chapter 6. Constructionum nisi per huismodi exempla possumus indicare. It's only by example that he's able to indicate what it is that makes the supremely excellent canzone. And he, in De Vulgare Eloquentia, it is a very technical work, especially the second book. It's interesting the way it combines the philosophical and the philological. He gives us, a technical analysis of the various literary genres in the vernacular. But at the same time, and he insists that any poet has to learn by assiduitate. It has to work by knowledge. Here it is. Strenuitate ingenii et artis assiduitate scientiariumque habitus. This is the opus et labor, is by acquiring assiduously knowledge, and yet that goes necessarily together with inspiration, with drinking at the fountain of Helicon and becoming the beloved of God. Dei dilectos, he takes from Virgil, and the poets are actually then raised to heaven in order to be called Deorumque filios, the sons or the children of God. Now, this De Vulgare, being the technical treatise that it is, nevertheless, it also gives us this speculative history of the human race as the history of language, right? From the primiloquium, the very first word of Adam. Dante has that incredible scope of vision brought together with the technical focus on exactly how poetry works. And I take that then as being paradigmatic for the kind of criticism that I want to try and expound some. And I think that I didn't really mention too much of the modern background, really, through German idealism to Nietzsche would be, fundamental, really, to continuing this genealogy. I wanted to touch on Walter Benjamin as going one step further, because there too, I think we have certainly in the concept of history, ja, die Begriffsgeschichte, historische Begriffsgeschichte, this conjugation of the particular and the absolute universal. I mean, he is projecting a universal history, but he's pointing out the way in which that universal history pivots from a particular that is taken out of the historical continuum by the interpreter and allowed to take on some novel significance, right? It sort of blasts through that historical continuum that puts everything under wraps as falling in to a certain frame of interpretation. You can actually blow that up, explode it, by taking some repressed particular out of history. Your relation to that as a critic can give it a new significance that then changes the significance of everything else in history. This is the messianic moment that can redeem what has been oppressed by, or repressed by, certain of the official histories that dominate our discourse in any culture. And this really is the revolutionary work that this kind of criticism, which I'm calling speculative criticism, and it's based on a kind of philology, very much so, in Benjamin, a material. He's the historical materialist. It's a materialist philology, because that's where you come into touch with the absolute particular. I think that's really what I'm hearing in the appeal to historical materialism, is that the material, the concrete, absolutely particular material can come back, the return of the repressed, and change our whole way of looking at things. Now, there is a connection between Benjamin and Dante. It's one that comes out in some of the reviews that I've done. Marco Maggi wrote this book, Dante and Benjamin, and he brings in Auerbach as well. What Dante gives to Benjamin, and actually see that it's not in the version that we have. I think it's the fifth thesis, where there's a French version that Benjamin was working on at the time when he died, where he quotes Dante, and he's getting this from Auerbach's 1929 Dante als Dichter der irdischen Welt. And Benjamin does see the dynamic of the flash of eternity in time. Right? This is what the Divine Comedy is offering us in so many portraits. We see eternity flashing in time, and this is the what Benjamin is trying to get at with the Jetztzeit, a flash of eternity. And there's actually an example from Dante that Benjamin brings up, probably working from Auerbach. Now, the Maggi reading is trying to really separate Benjamin and Auerbach, because with Auerbach, in the theory of figura, there's a stress on the continuity between the anti-type, the historical type that then comes back later in history, or I get that would be the type and then its fulfillment. Auerbach does really stress how the characters in the Commedia are presented in their fulfillment in eternity, the fulfillment of their historical lives on earth, which are then recalled. And so, this is the biblical typology, Jesus being the fulfillment of the type of Moses on the mount, on Mount Sinai, then Jesus on giving the Sermon on the Mount is fulfilling. I've come not to destroy but to fulfill, says Jesus. And Maggi wants to stress the fact that for Benjamin, it's not so much the continuity as the rupture of history that he emphasizes. So that's a valid point. And yet, nevertheless, history is really opened to eternity in unprecedented ways by Dante's portraits in the Divine Comedy. I think I better bring in here another exchange, another critical exchange, like the one that we started from as the seed for this workshop between Justin and myself. One with Vittorio Montemaggi and his book on theology as consisting in human encounter. And that's what we have in the Divine Comedy, is encounters with human beings. The theological revelation of the Commedia is always mediated through these human encounters. And see, this is my sense of theology as well, that it's the absolute mystery of the other person before you, which puts into play the whole dynamic of negative theology, the other, as we have it relayed by French theory, like Levinas or Derrida. This is another way of understanding the kind of theological revelation that takes place in the Divine Comedy. Now, to come to how the synergism between philosophy and philology works itself out, I wanted to reflect a little bit on Vico. And we have these passages del metodo, because Vico really does then embrace a binary and actually more a hybrid method, very much a hybrid method where philology and philosophy are both necessary in order to be able to recover the origin. It's really a philosophy about origins as well. The origin of humanity, the origin of thought. And we need the concrete particulars of philology. They give us certainty in Vico's system. He looks very much at the artifacts. I would like to show you the frontispiece from the Vita Nuova. Maybe some of you have that in mind, right, with the eye of God in the triangle at the top, and then this beam reflecting through the lady with a winged helmet representing metaphysics, and the light reflected down then to the poet, and all of the objects, the artifacts of archaeology lying around. Philology and archaeology give us these certain particulars to start from, but in order to understand them, we have to be able to enter into the minds of those who have written our texts in the traditions that we study, and Vico is interested in going much further back than that, long before there were texts or writing, to recover the original consciousness that crosses the threshold to humanity. And he does this by his method, based on what we can see in the historical record of the institutions which, human beings have formed. He focuses on religion, some sort of an awe and worship vis-a-vis the gods, on matrimony, and on sepultura, on burial. These are really the distinguishing marks of humanity. And then he's trying to understand what kind of thinking can produce these institutions, and just the whole record that we have, the anthropological record of humanity. In order to do that, he has to use his imagination. And this is where, I think this is a kind of historical imagination, but it moves into the philosophical register of the universal, because he's trying to discover the universal, he says, modifications in the mind that have determined this human history from its very beginnings. And they're still there, right? The history of the present, as Foucault would say, it's there in our minds, what has made all of human history. Of course, we don't really know what makes nature tick, because we didn't make nature, but we made human history. That comes out of our own human resources, and therefore we can recover it and reconstruct it by a reflective method, by a self-reflective method, which is actually another one of the key coordinates for speculative criticism, as I construe it. And to take an example, which is really more than an example, how does language begin? What is the first word? For Vico, it has to be the name of God, as also for Dante with that primiloquium. Right? Dante thought it was El, the Hebrew name of God. He changes his mind. It becomes rather I when you get to Paradiso 26. But in any case, language begins with the name of God. In some sense, maybe language is the name of God. That is, it's the utterance of the all and the infinite at its origins. Then it has to differentiate and narrow down in order to deal with a world of objects. But that whole world of objects, which science presupposes and deals with, the question is, where does that come from? What produces this world of objects? And Vico is imagining that it's produced by an act of signification. The very fact of saying, this signifies that. That is what makes us human. That's how language originates. And it originates before there is any this or that. This or that come out of this original act of signification. When Vico imagines this in the forest, the giants, thunder and lightning, and the first thought is, God is angry. This is an anthropomorphization. They're terrified. They've been terrified for endless millennia previously. Animals in the wilderness, but it's all at the level of sensation. And the minute the storm is over, the sensation ceases, and it's forgotten. But something different happens when this act of creating a significance, that this means something. God is angry. It's like when I'm angry, and my body, moves in all sorts of uncontrollable
don't get him
ways.
angry.
Yeah. That's what it's like. And so this first human thought of God, and people even said, like Zeus. That's the hissing of the lightning. Zeus in Greek for Zeus is a reminiscence, right, of this first word. Now, I'm not proposing that as a scientific etymology, but it's exemplary of a way of thinking, really. And I think it's in some ways comparable to this, circumstantial sort of thinking. It is a leap from particular to universal, and everything that comes later in language and in culture is somehow contained in this original event for Vico. Let me just refer here to these paragraphs del metodo, where he says at the beginning of the second paragraph, per tutto ciò dobbiamo cominciare da una qualche cognizione di Dio. We have to begin from a certain cognition of God, della quale non siano privi gli uomini, quantunque selvaggi, fieri ed immani. Vico does want to maintain that all human beings have this intuition of God. This word intuition, incidentally, you remember, comes up at the very end of Ginsberg's essay. And he wants to differentiate between a higher intuition, which would have pretensions to some sort of super sensible knowledge, and that's not what he's talking about. He's focused on a lower intuition, futile, right? Being able to sense things. I think female intuition is often evoked, and animal smell as having a kind of intelligence that cannot be rationally accounted for. We can't get there. We can only sort of run after with our rational accounting. Intelligence flashes more quickly than discourse can follow. And this gives Vico a kind of internal knowledge, is what he says. He wants to really know humanity and really all of human institutions from the inside. That is, by reconstructing in imagination, the science of imagination, as Verene's book has it. He wants to reconstruct our humanity from the inside out. You do look externally at those artifacts, but in order to get to their real meaning, you have to have an internal method, such as this speculative philology that Vico gives us, and really develops. Now, how could that possibly work for us? I think this is what we're doing in theoretical readings. We're looking at texts which have a positive presence and analyzing their objective qualities. But we're also invested in it personally, and we're bringing it into contact with backgrounds of our own, and we create self-reflexively some kind of an internal knowledge of the texts, the artifacts that we're studying. That certainly is one of the crucial dimensions, I think, of the sort of speculative philology that I want to advocate. And of course, you're aware that there has been the new philology. There was that movement which tried to embrace theory. There's like Stephen Nichols or Jerome McGann, and I think this goes back to about I think 90, is that right? When that issue of speculum came out, and so I'm suggesting that there is some sort of a precedent, a frame to build on, and I've tried to suggest some ways of my own for developing this hybrid approach that really would like to do justice equally to the absolute particular of the philological and the wide-ranging universal scope of speculative insight that philosophical criticism aims at.